Okay, this is Module 4, Lecture 1. Basically in this module we're going to be examining society from a couple of different viewpoints. We're basically doing an analysis of what society is and how we can look at it. And as we spoke about earlier, we've talked about the difference between macro and micro sociology. So we're going to take each of those in turn. We're going to start with macro sociology in the first part of this lecture. By the time we get to lecture 3, we should be dealing with micro sociology. So when we're talking about macro sociology, we're talking about examining society, quote unquote, looking at the big picture. So we're looking at the very large elements of society, we're looking at the broad features of society. If we go back to our sociological perspectives, macro sociology is much more likely the perspective or the way of looking at society that's going to be used by functionalists and conflict theorists. Both of those fall generally under macro sociology. So if we want to take a look at society, we're going to be taking a look at, as we said, very large elements of society. And basically the easiest thing to start with is the idea of looking at the social structure of a society. So if we thought about society as a building, the structure itself, the entire framework of the building would be considered the social structure. So this talks about how we as individuals fit into society as a whole and how our places in society influence our patterns of behavior, influence our thinking and values and our beliefs. So we learn all those things, as we talked about in the earlier module in socialization. We learn many of our beliefs from society, well, the majority of them, and that it is our specific place within the society which is going to have a lot to do with the things that we learn. So when we talk about the social structure, we're talking about, like I said, the very large components of society. Think about it, again, as a building with all sorts of different rooms and floors and components to it, and where we fit into that structure is going to have a large part to do with who we are. We can also talk about a society's culture. Clearly, culture is much bigger than an individual. It's made up of hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of people. So we talk about within a society, that society's, again, a lot of the collective things we already talked about. Language, beliefs, values, behaviors, gestures, many of the things we talked about in Module 2 make up a society's culture. So when we're looking at culture as a whole, we are not necessarily looking at the behavior of individuals, we're looking at broad patterns of behavior, which is why it fits into this examination of macro sociology. Clearly we can talk about culture from a micro-sociological standpoint when we talk about the behavior of individuals, but for right now we're talking about the larger elements. Okay? Something we will absolutely be discussing in a later module is the concept of social class. Clearly we know that within society there are levels. This will be the focus of next module. But when we talk about those levels, we talk about grouping people for the most part on broad, again, categorizations such as income, educational, occupation. So when you have large numbers of people with very similar levels of those things, that definition tends to be considered social class. We'll see that there's many different ways of stratifying or leveling societies, but the one we're most familiar with clearly in our own society is that of social class. We can talk about the idea of social status. Okay? What place in society does an individual occupy? Okay, that has to do with what we sometimes call our status set, a series or a set of characteristics when taken as a whole defines where we occupy a place in society. There we can see I listed 2 subsets to that. Within social status we can talk about 2 types of statuses. One would be an ascribed status, a status which is largely involuntary, something we have very little to do with. Could be something we are born with or something that sometimes we acquire in the course of our life, but something that we would probably say were we given the choice, we may or may not decide to do that thing. Examples that we give of ascribed statuses, especially when we talk about those we acquire at birth, would be, for instance, what class you are born into or who your parents are. The old saying goes, we can choose our friends, but we cannot choose our family. So you may say, okay, I don't know why, or you might not say why, but one of your your complaints about your social status might be, I was born into a poor family. Once again, there's nothing you could have done about that. That's just something that happened. That would be considered an ascribed status. Other statuses, things like race, gender, even physical characteristics, considering your appearance, are things that would be considered ascribed status, something that you have very little to do with. And again, we often think about ascribed status as something that happens at birth or early in life, things that we have very little control over. But it also could be things that happen to us in the course of a lifetime. So a person who suffers a debilitating injury or becomes sick during their lifetime and changes their physical characteristics or their abilities, again, that person did not choose that, very likely did not choose that behavior. One rarely, we talk about the idea of chooses to get, let's say, a spinal injury at work and become paralyzed, but that would certainly change that person's status in society. It would put them in different categories and affect, again, their social standing. So we would say that that's clearly an ascribed status, something that's largely involuntary. And an achieved status we typically think of as something that is based on a person's own individual behaviors or choices. Okay? So a lot of the other things we talked about when we talked about placement in society, things like education, job, we tend to think about those things as things that are based on an individual's own decisions and actions. So you as a college student probably are in college for the purposes of getting a degree so you can get a better job. And we would say that you are then moving up this social ladder. Again, what you're trying to do is influence your social status based on something that's under your control, your ability to enroll in and take classes and graduate. So when you graduate, you will have a diploma or degree, and that degree will then affect your social status. So we would say that your education is an achieved status, something that you worked to gain. Each of these types of statuses, both achieved and ascribed, provide guidelines for our behavior. Okay? Often, again, usually sitting in front of a room full of students, I would say, okay, does your status as a student affect your behavior? Clearly the fact that you are now watching this video, or you were sitting in a classroom, or that you're writing an assignment or an essay or taking an exam are examples of how your statuses affect your behavior. We'll talk about that a little more in just a minute. Again, when we talk about status in society, we talk about sometimes it's necessary to let other people know in society about the various statuses that we occupy. So there are physical recognitions we have of each other's statuses, and we call those, I'm sure you've heard this term before, a status symbol. Once again, symbol from our discussion in an earlier module is anything that has any type of attached meaning. So I'll often ask a classroom full of students, can you give me some examples of status symbols? And if they're not immediately forthcoming, I sometimes do, a little subtle hint, and maybe you can't see this, but I hope you can. And then somebody will usually pick up on it. A wedding ring. A wedding ring is an example of a status symbol. Okay? What is my status? My status is that of a married person. So I wear a symbol to let other people know in society that I occupy that status. Not only is that supposed to affect my behavior, right, knock on wood, but also is generally supposed to let other people know either how my behavior is supposed to change or might alter the behavior of other people in society in regard to the status that I'm telling people that I'm occupying. Okay? Again, I make the joke, why don't I just take it off? Well, besides getting in a lot of trouble for that, I would then be, in a sense, kind of not portraying a specific status, and then could, again, have very serious repercussions, not only for myself, but, society. I often ask people, if you were just standing on a street corner talking with friends and a person walked up to you and told you they wanted you to leave the street corner, you would probably question why that person's telling you to do that, or maybe refuse to do it. But if that person then reached in his or her pocket and produced a metal object, a badge, then you're probably more likely then to say, okay, I recognize now you have the authority to ask me to leave this environment or move on somewhere else or clear the corner. Once again, what a police badge is a representation of a person's status in society and therefore affects our behavior. The last example I usually use, and I usually ask a class of people who's ever been in court before, and hopefully not for very serious reasons, but if you've ever been in a courtroom and you've gotten there before court convenes, it's usually a pretty hectic and chaotic, a lot of people running around, shuffling papers, talking, having discussions. You're maybe not even sure who is who, you're not sure which lawyer is there for which side, or what the people in the gallery are doing there, or the court reporters who are running around. You might not be sure completely who's in charge. But then at one specific moment, an individual will walk in the room and everybody's behavior changes. Everybody usually gets very quiet, certainly stands up if they were sitting, pays attention, and follows directions. And I usually say, who was that person? And clearly most people will say that was the judge. And I will say, well, how did you know who the judge was just based on, you know, a person walking into the room? And the answer is, of course, the judge is the person wearing a black robe. Okay, so a black robe, once again, is a symbol of that person's status, and therefore changes the ways we interact with each other. And so all those examples, a wedding ring, a police badge, a judge's black robe, are all examples of what we might call positive status symbols, and then we can also flip the coin and say that there are clearly some examples of negative status symbols in society, or symbols of people's negative status is a better way of putting that. So once again, I sometimes say, can people come up with examples? One of the most best and most prominent examples I usually get is something like a prison jumpsuit or prison uniform. And I say, well, what does a prison jumpsuit look like? And most people in this day and age would say, you know, a bright orange jumpsuit, a onesie. And I say, well, what if you really, really, really just liked overalls? What if you really, really love the color orange? Why wouldn't you just walk around in society with orange overalls on? Clearly, because we'd say that most people in our society equate that outfit with being a prisoner. So if you were to walk through a mall with that on, it would be pretty likely that somebody in that environment would mistake you for an escaped prisoner, and usually probably alert the police or the authorities about that. So we talk about things like, you know, in some states and jurisdictions, people are made to wear or put special stickers or license plates on their cars when they've been convicted of DUIs. Sometimes we refer to things as Megan's Law registration or sex offender registry as an example of a negative status symbol. From literature, if any of you have ever read Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The Scarlet Letter. So we definitely know that Hester Prynne, the heroine of the novel, was made to wear a huge scarlet A sewn onto her clothing as a result of having committed the crime at the time, this is Puritan times, of adultery. So all these are examples of negative status symbols, a symbol which a person displays, or in some cases is told to display, as a way of demonstrating a negative status in society. One other thing when we talk about social status is the idea of a master status. Not necessarily everyone has a master status, although when we use a very broad definition of master status, we can sometimes include many more people in it. But for the most part, the idea of a master status is the idea that a status that kind of cuts across all the rest of our status set, and in a sense kind of overshines or dominates our master status, or our status set rather, and that is the status by which we're probably going to be acknowledged or known by most individuals in society. And once again, we can look at a large range of definitions for this. If I were just to say to you, Bill Gates, you would probably say that is one of the richest people in the world. So having an enormous amount of wealth would be considered a master status, despite the fact that you may or may not know other things about Bill Gates, other contributions that he made not only to science, but you also might know him as a philanthropist. But chances are the majority of people in society know Bill Gates as just being a billionaire, so an incredibly wealthy person, so we might consider that to be his master status. If you are in the Hensland text following along, there's a picture in there of an individual who, when I show usually that person's picture or ask them to look at it in the book, I say, who is that? And some people will say, that is Stephen Hawking. And I will say, okay, do you know who Stephen Hawking is? And those people obviously know him by name will probably say things like he's a physicist, he is a contributor to many of the most important theories about the nature of the universe and time, and is actually kind of built on and expanded and to a certain degree improved on many of Einstein's theories about how the universe works. Largely we could say that you know, Stephen Hawking, his master status probably should be one of the smartest people who's ever lived. But once again, if you're looking at the photo, a lot of other people who might not know who Stephen Hawking is from a professional standpoint would say that's a person in a wheelchair. He suffers from Lou Gehrig's disease and is basically completely disabled, can speak with the aid of a computer-generated or computer voice generator, is able to basically move a few fingers on one hand and transport himself through an automated wheelchair. So we could certainly say, you could make the case for maybe Stephen Hawking having two master statuses, one being one of the smartest people ever to live, and second being a disabled or a handicapped person. And if you did not know who he was and what his contributions to science were, chances are, if you saw him on the streets, you might more often say that's a person in a wheelchair. So those are examples of perhaps, like we said, negative statuses, negative master statuses. Sometimes we can talk about the idea that in society we can experience what's called status inconsistency, when some parts of our statuses there's discrepancy between one status that we occupy and another. We can sometimes refer to that, and we'll talk about that in a later section, the idea of status inconsistency. Okay, so along with this idea, now if we think about social status as a place in society that we occupy, then we can think of the next example, roles, as being how our behavior is influenced by those statuses. So we could say that we occupy a status, but we play a role. Okay? So if my status is professor, then how I go about performing in that status would be considered a role. So these are behaviors and occupations and privileges that are associated with a status, but more specifically influence our behavior. So I can certainly say, how do I go about playing the role of a professor? And one is clearly that I'm currently creating this video for you, that I am speaking about these topics, that I am, when I'm grading essays or quizzes or looking at your online discussion boards, I am playing the role of a professor. Your status in this class is that of a student. How do you play that role? By watching the videos, by taking the quizzes, by participating in the online discussions. Okay? So those are all behaviors. Certainly that goes hand in hand to a large degree with obligations, things that we must do, things that we are required to do. So if the status you're talking about is your job, and the fact that you get up out of bed and go to work on Monday mornings when you don't feel like it is certainly an example of an obligation associated with a role. Also, we can talk about the privileges associated with a role. So clearly, as a student, you have the privilege, just the fact that you signed up for this course, have the privilege of watching these videos. You might not think about it that way all the time, but one of the privileges then associated with the successful completion of this course would be a grade, and then a cumulative grade point average, and a cumulative transcript that would entitle you to successful completion of a degree, which then allows you to move into certain jobs that you might not have been able to before. Certainly as a student, you have the ability to access things like the library and databases, and to just to be on campus in the first place. So as a professor, my privileges are things like vacation and sick days, and the ability to attend conferences, and participate in college committees. So these are all things that we call behaviors, obligations, and privileges, which are associated with roles. certainly when we look at how people play roles, there's a certain amount of freedom that is associated with different roles, but they also involve constrictions, and we look at the ways that roles and role playing changes our behavior based on the types of roles we're asked to do. I often ask students, usually by now you've seen me for a couple of weeks, and at this point in the semester I usually say, what's one thing you've never seen me wear in here? And whether or not it's different things like shorts or anything like that. One of the most common example, or one of the most correct ones that I usually talk about, is the absence of a tie. Okay, I never wear ties. I don't like ties. Having studied a little bit about some of the, the sociology of fashion, I understand how the tie became a piece of modern wear, but to me they're just a little ridiculous. It seems kind of silly to me that I would wear something that I consider to be uncomfortable by closing off my neck and tying a piece of bright colored cloth around there for some reason. And then after going on this little tirade, I usually say to my class, so I guess you can assume that I don't own any ties. And of course most students will shake their heads and I'll say, no, I have actually dozens and dozens of ties in my closet at home. And they weren't all gifts. Some I actually went out and purchased myself. So why would I have ties when I feel so strongly about not wanting to wear them? Clearly, we can say that there are times, and I have appeared in court as a expert witness, testifier in court cases, and I wear a tie. Again, the idea being that if I didn't wear a tie, I would be worried that the words coming out of my mouth might not have the same impact or import that they would if I was now suddenly wearing a colorful piece of cloth around my neck. Now I expect to be taken seriously and given respect. So we do things that are expectations of us, and we comply with those expectations when we play roles in a society. Two more things we're going to discuss in more detail in later modules. Clearly we can talk about groups. Groups are obviously more than one person, individuals who consistently interact with one another. Like I said, this is a subject of a much more detail in a later module, but we can generally say that the groups that we choose to associate with have a huge impact on our behavior, as well as allow society to make certain judgments about us as individuals based on the groups that we choose to associate with. So our role in social groups has a lot to do with examining society. And the very last thing would be the idea of social institutions. And social institutions are the most broad and large elements of society, once again fitting under this idea of macrosociology, that kind of defines what society is. One of the ways that I typically, and there's a list of these on page 105 in the Henslin text, you can see a large chart that talks about social institutions. And basically the way I'd come to best describe social institutions are those very large organizations made up of lots and lots and lots of things within them that are the ways that society gets its needs met. So once again, kind of back to the functionalist view, thinking about society as a living thing, society has needs. And if the society doesn't meet those needs, it could potentially cease to exist. So social institutions are those large organizations, or sometimes compounds of organizations, that exist to meet society's needs. So what are some of these needs? Well, I could just say to you generally, society needs to hand down information from one generation to the next. So if a society were not to hand down its knowledge to the next generation, would it be likely that the society might face extinction? Yes, because the generation coming up without that knowledge might not be able to function and might just cease to exist as a society. So we would say the basic need is to hand down information from one generation to the next. What's that social institution? Education. Society has a need to keep its members alive. So if large numbers of people were wiped out by disease or injury, then the society might not exist without its members. So it has to keep its members healthy and repair injury and cure disease. What do we call that social institution? Medicine. Last example, society has a need to protect its members from other societies that might wish to do us harm. Okay, so what would we call that? The military. So each of these things interact with each other and provide society with its basic needs. But within each of those social institutions, there are many, 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 many organizations, groups. Within those, there are statuses and roles that people play. So I could say to you, go back to medicine for a second, what are some of the very large groups? Hospitals, insurance companies, HMOs, clinics. What are some of the statuses and roles? Doctors and nurses and patients and insurance carriers, individuals, those kind of things. So social institutions are these very, very, very broad elements of society that contain all these other things within them, but they meet society's basic needs. And we will go into more detail on that in just a little bit. Okay, the next section we're going to be discussing societal transformation.